If you remember from class, southern pines are one of the species that has a recurrent growth pattern. This is a branch from a loblolly pine tree. And of course, loblolly pine and all pines are evergreen. That means they keep their needles for more than 1 year. So at any point in time, you have needles on the tree that may be up to 18 months old. So we can see on this branch, there are needles. This is 2021, January of 2021. There were needles, these sort of newer green needles that were formed starting in spring of 2020. And then there's a few needles left further down on the branch here and here. You can see they're pretty beat up and have almost all fallen off. Those were formed starting in spring of 2019. And of course, in this coming March, starting about March 1st, this terminal bud will burst and we'll get the production of foliage for the 2021 growing season. So again, loblolly pine is a recurrently flushing species, which means it produces multiple growth cycles in 1 year. And there's some tricks we can use to identify the different growth cycles. Each growth cycle typically starts on the stem with a zone of sterile bracts. It's a zone with no needles. So that indicates that this is the start of a new growth cycle. Typically, the first growth cycle of a year is the longest one. Not always, but very often. Okay, so when we back up, you can see here's a little region of sterile bracts, and then we have the production of needles here. So from here to here is the first growth cycle from 2020. So we're going to measure the length of each growth cycle. Okay, so I'll go from the beginning of that sterile region to the end of the needles that were produced. And that's 24 centimeters. And then on each growth cycle or flush that I measure, I'm going to measure the lengths of 3 fascicles or sets of needles. Okay, you can see loblolly pine has needles in fascicles or groups of 3, occasionally 2, but usually 3. And we're just going to measure the length of those fascicles. So that one's 18.5 centimeters. That one's 18.5. And that one's 18, that's 19 centimeters. So we would average those and record that as the needle length for the first flush. And the length of the flush was 24 centimeters. Okay, so then we look and identify the next one. Okay, here's the next flush, this region of sterile bracts, and the sterile region for the next flush. So we measure from the beginning of that growth cycle to the end. That's 13.5 centimeters. The 3 fascicles, 17 centimeters, 16 centimeters, 17.4 centimeters. Okay, so average those and record those as the needle length for the second flush. Okay, here's a third flush. Region of sterile bracts in the end. We go from the beginning to the end of that flush. That's 10.2 centimeters. Measure the lengths of 3 fascicles. 17.1 centimeters. 16.9, 17.6. And here's a fourth. So go from the beginning to the end of that flush. That's 7.5 centimeters. And we'll record the lengths of 3 fascicles from that flush. 13.5 centimeters, 13.2, and 13.5. Average those and record that as the needle length.